up, everybody? This is Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations, number 25. We're starting to get up there with all these really dope conversations. So in the building, we're giving a little bit of diasporic, international, technological swag to the project. We have Dr. Justin Burton from Rider University and Dr. Colleen Neff, who is visiting professor at the College of William & Mary. What's going on, good people? How y'all?
We're good. How are you?
Good to be here.
Good, thanks. I'm good. I'm ready for this conversation because you're actually going to still be teaching me a little something. So both of you all are do ethnomusicology, anthropology, all that other good stuff, right? And then you're also editing a special issue on the Global South of the Journal of Pop Music Studies. So why don't we start there a little bit? So if both of you can kind of give your own insight and how you are articulating what the Global South is, that'd be real dope.
Do you want to take that one, Allie? You want to start it?
Oh, I could start with that. I'm a media anthropologist, so I look at how modes of communication and technology enable one person or group of people to reach other people or groups of people and resources. That's my interest. So I look at popular music as the main medium by which contemporary youth throughout the world do that. So of course I have to turn to the Dirty South to find the connection between traditional knowledges about using the voice and performances surrounding the voice to make things happen in the world, and what's happening today with contemporary digital media, popular music, TV, movies, fashion, etc., for subcultures to reach out to the broader mainstream cultures of the world and sort of furtively get in there and get resources and take them back into their own communities.
Okay. Justin, what you got for us? What's the Global South?
Yeah, so I should also say that I'm actually trained in musicology. I don't have the ethno or anthropological background, even though I try to hang out with people who do whenever I can.
Right.
They're usually nice enough to me to let me. And so I kind of come from even though I'm trained as a musicologist, I think probably I fit best in like a cultural studies kind of realm. And so one of my big interests in the Global South is sort of articulating what it is that's happening in the world. So one of our jumping off points is thinking about the Global South not as a geographic region, right? So if you think Global South and purely technically, then you cut the globe in half at the equator and you've got the South and you've got the North. But that's not really at all what we're looking at. A lot of the Global South falls beneath the equator, but a whole lot of it also falls in what would technically be north of the equator. And mostly how we're defining the Global South is the area of the world that is not the North Atlantic. So North America, United States, Western Europe, right, these colonizing powers. And so we end up falling into discourses of post-coloniality, discourses of third world, fourth world. If you're familiar with Vijay Prashad's The Poorer Nations, he does a really nice job of laying out in that book where the Global South is, and it's less about where it is and more about what the Global South does. What it does is it pushes back against particularly like neoliberal forces that want to that want to focus only on exports, that want to take advantage of people's lack of resources, and often those lack of resources come from a colonial history where resources were taken from and then never really returned fairly. And so Prashad defines it in that way, and one of the things that we want to do in this issue is think, okay, if this is the Global South, if this is what the Global South acts like, if this is what the Global South looks like or does, what does music sound like when it comes out of there? And so we've got a few different pieces coming in. You're talking about Outkast. We've got something on Miami bass. We've got some South African literature, some African radio in the American South, and a lot of what we want to do is think about, and your piece is doing a lot of this, is think about how the American South how the U.S. South fits into the Global South, right? Because if we're not talking about strictly geographic regions, then what that means is in a country like the United States, which is politically the North Atlantic or the global North, we're going to have pockets of global Southern discourse or global Southern activity happening within it. And the U.S. South tends to produce a lot of that, especially when the U.S. South gets dirty.
I mean, I think it's dope because normally, if you think about the dirty South from a hip hop perspective, you automatically just associate it with, the United States the United States South, right? This idea of dirtiness in terms of history and memory. Ali, in your piece that you were talking about, Senegalese hip hop, this idea of the African diaspora is polyhistorical is really dope because that gives multiple entry points into what that dirtiness looks like, whether it's colonialism, post-colonialism, the slave trade, all that good stuff. And I want to talk about this a step further in terms of, this idea of the dirty South in hip-hop outside of a United States context. So, Ali, could you tell a little bit about your remastering article that you were talking about, this idea of a polyhistorical South and how hip-hop fits into what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. I did about 5 years of ethnographic research in the Mississippi Delta with blues and gospel practitioners. And I originally went to work with blues practitioners, but I had been listening to Southern hip-hop for some time before that. I always liked booty bass and stuff coming out of the South, stuff coming out of Houston, long before I ever went to Mississippi. But I had also listened to international music and lots of reggae. So when I arrived in the Mississippi Delta to start doing this research, I was really disappointed with how all of the discourses about how great the music was there completely cut the music of young people out of the discourses and out of the resources associated with those discourses, when what I was hearing from these young people was nuanced. It reflected skill and schooling. I mean, it was like absolutely intense, beautiful, vocally beautiful, lyrically complex, imaginative, just totally unique music that was often being made improvisatorily. So it was really exciting for me to hear that. So I started to work with these young hip-hop practitioners and decided that it was a good time in 2005, 2006 when I started really getting into writing up this research to intervene in discourses about authenticity and Southern music and authenticity in hip-hop. So as I started to deconstruct these ideas of, oh, the blues was this thing and the hip-hop is something totally inauthentic that's been imported, I actually started to the South, I started to realize, wait, these radio DJ styles, these gospel improvisatory styles, the blues, all of these feed into the dozens, women's poetry, all of these feed into the textures of Southern hip-hop, and that global hip-hop would be nothing without Southern hip-hop, this is actually at the core. The more I looked into the historical and cultural forces surrounding this, I found that not only was contemporary U.S. Southern hip-hop influenced by the blues and gospel and these traditional forms, heavily influenced and heavily in conversation with these forms, but it was also crisscrossed by global forces, especially Jamaican dancehall DJ styles, which we all acknowledge heavily influenced New York hip-hop, but they've been continuing to influence Houston hip-hop, Miami hip-hop, Atlanta, right, and coming in through these coastal cities and influencing the rest of the South. That original sounds and styles are still being made in conversation with African immigrants to the U.S. South, who are very much a part of these hip-hop communities, and that the U.S. South as a region also needs to be de-essentialized because we start to understand that it's actually made up of a collection of overlapping circuits by which young people are actually moving throughout the global Black diaspora and the U.S. Black diaspora.
I mean, because, oftentimes when you think about the South, it's often, well, I guess from a U.S. perspective, it's often kind of just cut off from conversations in hip-hop. Like, we're just finally starting to get conversations about the contributions of Southern hip-hop to this larger, hip-hop narrative. And I think that Outkast is a great way to, articulate that. The connections between this idea of struggle that still kind of runs rampant throughout the South in terms of the civil rights movement and slavery. And I mean, like, they use so many different tropes that articulate a type of Southernness that oftentimes get swept under the rug as non-relevant in terms of just a larger conversation about hip-hop discourse. But I would like to, kind of open up this idea about how Outkast's articulation of Southernness kind of speaks to these overlapping conversations that we're having about the global South and the dirty South, and was wondering your thoughts about, why are they still, relevant in how we are articulating what Southernness can look like on an international scale.
Why don't you start?
That's a mouthful. All right.
Yeah.
So when I think about Outkast, I have like a few disconnected ideas here, and maybe I'll throw them out, and I'll let those of you in this conversation who are smarter than me tie them together, and then I'll take credit for it if that works for you. So one of my thoughts is Atlanta, right? You think Outkast, you think Atlanta, and Atlanta is in Sarig's book, The Third Coast, right? So if we're talking about attention being brought to Southern hip hop and Southern rap as legitimate things to talk about, we should definitely mention Sarig and the work that book does and did and still does for people who want an entry point to thinking about this seriously. And also, even as the conversation is lagging behind about the importance of Southern hip hop, sales, of course, are far ahead of that. People have been listening to and buying this for a long time, and I don't know, compartmentalizing in some way, like this isn't real, but oh my God, I have to listen to it all the time.
Yeah.
And and so in Sarig's book, he talks about Atlanta as crossroads, and this is sort of a nice overlapping point with what Allie does in her Mississippi Delta hip hop book, because obviously the blues crossroads are this like very important signifier, and the idea of hip hop and the blues overlapping in this space, not as something that's real and something that's unreal, but as two forms of a similar idea. To sort of pull that out and think now of Atlanta as a crossroads, as a cosmopolitan space, and specifically as the place that when the migration reverses, Atlanta's the city that swells, right? And in fact, for those who live around Atlanta, swells a little too much, if you've ever tried to drive anywhere. And so one of the things I think about Outkast plugging into this larger discourse specifically has to do with their location in Atlanta, and Atlanta as a cosmopolitan space in general. But then, man, when you listen to what they're doing, and again, I'll think geographically here. We drop Atlanta right here, and you listen to Outkast sound, and you hear Memphis, and you hear Miami. Yeah. And you hear North Carolina, right? Yep. Like that My Favorite Things remix of John Coltrane is bad. And you hear some New York, and you hear some West Coast, and you hear Houston, and you hear the Caribbean, and Atlanta just becomes this place that all these sounds like start swirling around and cascading down into this thing that Outkast is. And in that way, this is maybe what I think an Atlanta sound is, because when I think of Janelle Monáe, I think of a lot of the same stuff, right? Is this amalgamation that in a Janelle Monáe song, in an Outkast song, you have like a tiny little history of black music, and specifically Southern black music, and not just U.S. South, but global South too, right? As we draw back down into the Caribbean and across the Black Atlantic. And we think of Miami bass as connected down into both West Indies and Latino culture, and how that stretches down into South America as well. Then we see Outkast, and not just Outkast, but we're talking about them specifically, Outkast, positioned in this place where all of these styles swirl around each other.
So not only Atlanta as a cosmopolitan space, but a transient space also, right? Like literal. I mean, the ins and out of Atlanta now as compared to, I guess the turning point for Atlanta for a lot of people is the 1996 Olympics, when it did become an international city. You know what I'm saying?
That's right. Yeah.
And using music to think about what that cosmopolitanism looks like in terms of of being a transitional, transient space. I think that's dope. And that was fully articulated for me, Justin. I don't know why you think that wasn't connected, but whatever.
I'll take it.
I think he's been thinking about this, don't you?
Allie, what do you think? What do you think the connections are?
Oh, I think thanks for leaving me with this, because I think cosmopolitanism really is the key here. I think it's the mainstream denial of Black cosmopolitanism, the just visceral gut reaction that mainstream white supremacist discourses have against Black cosmopolitanism is the key element in the marginalization of Southern hip-hop, Southern poetic forms, African hip-hop, African poetic forms. That the most dangerous thing about all of these forms of popular music is that they assert an undeniable global, capital B, Black cosmopolitanism that is quite dangerous in counterpoint to this white supremacist neoliberal stronghold on the resources associated with cosmopolitanism, mobility, what's the word I'm looking for? Extra income, cash flow, access to global goods and services, education. But Southern hip hop makes it impossible for the mainstream to deny that. So I think on one hand, there's this consumption of the idea, the cosmopolitanism that is carried in Southern hip-hop, this visceral consumption of it, but there's an intellectual reaction against that cosmopolitan Black presence. And that's what I think Outkast does better than anybody else, is it makes that cosmopolitanism absolutely undeniable. However, they sort of model this cosmopolitan space that's inaccessible to white supremacists, right? They're at the center of this Black cosmopolitan space. If you watch their videos, they're creating it time and time again, this utopic space that is a model of Black cosmopolitanism, and I think that's the most dangerous and most powerful thing that Outkast does. And I think that that model is very much modeled on Atlanta as a cosmopolitan Black city that is economically undeniable. It has to be looped in because it posits itself in the center of these economic and social forces.
I think additionally, though, that one of the reasons that Outkast kind of produces this utopic cosmopolitan space is their use of technology. So Justin, I want to kind of come to you a little bit in terms of your expertise, because their use of technology, whether it's the literal sound of technology like synthesizers on Equipment, you know what I'm saying, or even thinking about technology in terms of radio delivery like speaker box. What do you think the significance of Outkast is in terms of how they use technology to articulate this southernness, this cosmopolitan southernness, if you will, that we've been discussing?
I think I'm going to say some stuff that we've been over, because what I hear in them again is echoes some familiar histories. Like that Synthesizers track features George Clinton, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of what they're doing there is, and with the AT aliens idea, with the idea of extraterrestrialism, it just sort of smacks of this this Afrofuturistic cosmology. If you is it the cover of Equimini, right? Where it's the two of them and there's a spaceship and some Nubian princess-looking people behind them, and like a Cadillac, and it's cohesive because it's on an album cover together. But otherwise, it's these loose signifiers that you can just sort of point to each one and label. But otherwise, it sort of is a few different things sort of thrown together at once. This is that amalgamation idea again. And all of them come back to this. They're calling on they're calling on Egypt. They're calling on mobility, and specifically Cadillacs, which hold a particularly important place in the history of Black Southern mobility.
Mm-hmm.
They're calling on outer space, and they themselves are aliens. And then they sit there as two different versions of a pimp, basically, right? With Andre with the feather in his cap, sort of out with his cane, and Big Boy, and these are their persona all the way through, right? It's like Big Boy is one kind, and Andre 3000 is another. And so we have all these different kind of signifiers together, and when I listen to a track like Synthesizers, what I hear are these Afrofuturistic signifiers that you see on the album cover. I hear them coming through in the track. One of the things that they do that I find really interesting, like on the Equimini track, if you listen to the hi-hat on that, it sounds and here's my problem is I listen to it and I think, oh, that is fascinating, and then I need to spend the next hour trying to figure out exactly how to describe what that hi-hat sounds like. The best I've come up with is like it's watery, right? And watery sounds are really familiar from things like blues and funk. But this sounds like water that someone dropped a live electrical wire into, right? It's wet and it's sizzly all at the same time. And this is a more subtle use of technology, right? If we want to talk about like Kanye West and technology, then we go immediately to the auto-tune and things like that. In Outkast, I think we get some more subtle kinds of ideas, like the kinds of effects they put on these fairly traditional sounds that then sets their music apart from other things, right? They sound like sometimes they sound like Miami bass, sometimes they sound like Houston hip hop, sometimes they sound like New York hip hop. But then there are these few little adjustments they've made in the timbre of a sound, or like through these technological means that makes you go, oh, it's Outkast, right? Even before you hear Andre's voice, even before you hear Big Boy's voice. And so it's that kind of thing in Equimini. You talk a lot in your piece for our issue about elevators, right? And that echoey tick-tock kind of thing. And what I find over and over with Outkast is that they have such a deeply layered sound and deeply produced sound that 10 years in, I hear something new in it when I put the headphones on. Which is what happened when I was reading your piece the other day, and I thought, oh man, that is an echoing clock all the way through there. Thanks, Regina, for pointing that one out. And so really, their uses of technology strike me as this sort of very definitely Afrofuturistic, right? Creating utopian spaces, as we talked about, or playing on the idea of alien, or drawing from African symbolism, but then more than that are these subtle little changes they make in the sounds that make it so that you know that they're Outkast. And I think that kind of folds in with some of what Ali's talking about, which is the ingenuity that comes with this sort of production. This is probably an old discourse. This is probably not something we have to fight for anymore, but it wasn't too long ago that a DJ didn't count as a musician, right? Or a producer didn't count as a musician. And I think from jump, you listen to any Outkast track, and whether it's Andre 3000 and Big Boy producing, or if it's Organized Noise or anyone else, you hear an intellectual savvy that goes into the making of these tracks.
Oh, yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. So. Have to end the conversation here, folks, but where can people get in contact with you? What are you working on besides the special issue, all that good stuff?
They can find me through my website at ethnolyrical, ethnollyrical.org. And I'm working on writing up my couple years of fieldwork, Wolof language fieldwork with women praise singers in Dakar, Senegal. Where I also worked with a lot of hip-hop musicians who were in deep conversation with the U.S. South.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You can find me, Justin D. Burton, D as in Daniel, .wordpress.com. I've got my site there that I update every now and then. And then I'm on Twitter at Justin D. Burton as well. So I'm working on the special issue with Ali, and then I'm working on a book manuscript called Post-Human Pop that talks about some of the stuff we were just talking about a minute ago. Not just technology, but post-humanity as a reorganization of what it is to be human, or just to be in general.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for giving us a little bit of your time and everything. This is the half-season finale, right? Like Scandal, the half-season finale of Outkasted Conversations.
Does that mean Facebook's going to blow up just like with Scandal?
Yeah, it better. Yeah, so I mean, like, appreciate you, and we'll see you all in August. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holla at y'all. Y'all be easy.